Why is crude down when OPEC has a fairly bullish report for next year?
Because the same OPEC, by their own numbers, also have some spare capacity left. And they are not the only ones in the world having spare capacity. I think this is a situation where you have A, recognition that you're not running out of oil even if markets are tight. B, recession fears in many quarters, including within OPEC. And then you have this constellation of President Biden and the G7 more generally trying to shore up higher oil production in order to push on with the sanctions. Markets, when you look at volatility the last 10 days, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, clearly have decided that the risk is to the downside. So they seem to be facing a ceiling and then always be bumping down when it gets volatility, rather than in the past bumping up and further up and treading a path upwards. And to me, that makes sense.
Why would OPEC Plus want significantly lower prices from here, particularly the plus bit, Russia?
I don't think OPEC Plus is happy with lower prices. We go back in time in 2020 when they were basically given the green light to stabilize the market. And since then, they have cut production, brought prices back up from these very low levels. But they have, in the recent months, not delivered the full amount of cuts they have promised. There's a huge amount of oil they haven't been produced because some of their members can't produce more. And that is why the Americans have a point when they say, if an organization is basically allowed, to manipulate the market and then doesn't deliver and prices continue to go up, then maybe those members of the organization which do have spare capacity have the obligation to follow through. That's an argument which you should not dismiss. No?
Well, if they did that, though, and they did that today, if Saudi Arabia and OPEC Plus did that today, wouldn't that come at the expense of the future spare capacity, which would then even aggravate the market more in some ways?
Yeah, I said this was an argument of those who want OPEC to act. It was not OPEC's argument. The Saudi Arabia's guys said this, and the UAE don't have that interest. I mean, they have the interest to holding OPEC Plus together. That means, number one, to keep Russia in the fold. Number two, to keep prices at reasonable levels. They ship what they think is reasonable, so that would be north of 100 perhaps. They share the fear of recession and demand destruction. But they do have the spare capacity by their own numbers. Saudi Arabia has always argued that they have capacity of 12.5 million barrels per day. We really have historically no reason to doubt that. They are now producing at about 10.5, so that's 2. And the UAE is probably another million. And that's not talking about those OPEC countries which are in civil unrest or civil war or under sanctions like Iran, Libya, Nigeria, where there would be more to be gained. And that's why the markets are eyeballing, and they look at this and they say, okay, there still is flexibility in the system, which it only requires a political decision to release. Whether that decision is forthcoming now when Biden visits them is an entirely different question. But there is some safety valves. And then in addition, of course, we have the hope that, and it seems to be the case, that production in the US is going up. And we already have 1 million barrels per day released in the market from the strategic petroleum reserves, where there's also more oil. So you have a total of 4 powerful safety valves in order to guard yourself and to push for this American policy.
So what do you think, in oil terms, comes out of the president's trip to the Gulf?
I think probably not that much. I think what is likely to be, you see some promises, some vague promises, nothing concrete, and then very little follow-up action. Because as I said, the amount of oil which OPEC is supposed to be producing and is not producing currently is already tremendous. And so even if they close the gap a little bit, that will not be a big game changer.
Christof,
but they will make peace and with a promise.
Well, one more quick one on this one. So if Saudi Arabia says, we're pumping enough, it's fine, but there's still peace to be made, is there an argument to be made that what we really need to see out of this trip is a redirection of trade flows? You get the cheaper, maybe price-capped Russian oil going to Asia, and then the Saudi supply going to Asia then goes to Europe. Like, in essence, is that a better solution right now?
Well, the rearrangement of trade flows is already happening, and that is a consequence of the current sanctions and of European Union policy, not a cause of anything. But one thing which is of course true is that, as we said earlier, OPEC Plus and Saudi Arabia in particular have an interest in staying together, in keeping the group as large as possible, in keeping Russia inside. And of course, the very last thing Russia wants in this situation is low oil prices. And so also from that side, you will have an attempt, as we know it from OPEC in the old days, at stabilizing the prices, which really means to keep them at least where they are.
If oil prices can be maintained at a relatively high level, supporting Russia, does that make it easier for Russia to cut gas off to Europe?
Good question.
On the surface, that is correct, but I don't think so, because the situation in both markets are really fundamentally different. And the biggest difference is when you talk about Europe is
Yep.
the European Union policy. In oil, they have now made a decision. They have a centralized decision of phasing out the
Yep.
oil, phasing out the oil on ships first, which happens to be the fungible part,
Yep.
not on pipelines. And that is all back to the lowest common denominator, this principle of unanimity. In gas, it is still how the whole sanction debate started, a very decentralized approach. There's nobody is forced to anything.
But looking at it from the other point of view, Russia's still making a lot of money out of oil. Does that make it, from a financial point of view, easier to cut the gas?
It would make it easier, but there's another fundamental distinction. Gas, which goes to Western Europe from Russia, cannot be redirected. It comes from Western Siberia. There are no pipelines to the east, to Asia, to Eastern Siberia, only pipelines to the west, to Western Europe. So everything which is shut in there, which is stranded, as we say, is a loss in revenue, which likely now is to be permanent, because Europe, of course, is scrambling and finding alternatives. And this decentralized policy has, just to make that point, has had great effect. We have 4 countries already who have said we don't want Russian gas, Bulgaria, Netherlands, Denmark, Lithuania. That's meant a decline of Russian gas imports of 16%. We have a lot of big countries like Germany who are trying to wean themselves off. And as a result, Russian gas imports in the EU account now for less than 20%. They used to be 40% at the beginning of the war. So this decentralized approach, every country does as good as it can, seems to be working better. It's not a surprise when you think about it, than the centralized approach, which tells everybody what to do and ends up with this lowest common denominator.
So, Christof, the question that I just really want to know is, does Germany have enough gas in the winter of 2023?
Unlikely. Germany is now what has happened, just like in the COVID years, now people look in the newspapers every day, the percentage to which storage is full. And actually the situation is not so bad. It's practically bang in the middle of the 5-year average German storage. But even if it would be at 90% plus before the beginning of the winter, that would be enough for about 2.5 months. In the winter is 3.5, 4 months. So it would never be enough. It always requires additional gas. Secondly, there is now, of course, the fear that Russia will be slow or haltingly playing these pins and needle games and bringing the gas back. And so the burghers of Germany are quite cautious, and electrical heating appliances and so are selling like hot potatoes. But I think there's a political thing here, in which I think it is quite obvious that the population at large is backing these measures of all parties, from a Green Party and a Social Democrat Party, of switching to gas, of replacing the oil, or replacing the gas and switching to coal. I'm sorry, and this is the way which will not cease to exist. So I'm pretty convinced, being German myself, that Germany, having made the announcement to phase out Russian gas by 2024, that's lightning speed in energy markets, will stick and will implement that.
It's going to be an interesting ride, isn't it, between now and then? Christof Ruhl, thank you very much indeed. Columbia University Senior Research Scholar at the Centre on Global Energy Policy. Greatly appreciated. We are done. European markets are now closed. These are the final numbers. Little tick higher during the auction for the FTSE 100, but only a tiny one, barely changing the landscape, as you can see, finishing up by around 0.2%. Oil stocks, just speaking to Christof there, very much under pressure today. Oil prices down circa 6%, let's call it that. The DAX and the CAC 40 doing a little bit better. We're going to carry on the conversation. We'll delve more into what is happening at Heathrow, what is going on with this energy story on the cable show, 5 p.m. here in London. DAB Digital Radio is where you'll find us, of course, on all your Bloomberg devices. The podcast will be available a little bit later, Spotify and iTunes, Alex.
All right, well, coming up, something we're also going to be talking about on radio as well is that final list of candidates vying to be the next UK Prime Minister. That's going to be published right after 6 p.m. UK time today. Rishi Sunak currently has the most public endorsements from fellow MPs. Those details next. This is Bloomberg.